Red Hollow Basin, near the Elk Mountains, Gunnison County, Colorado, the 27th of November, 1891. The entrance to Silver Vein No. 3 mines sat on the mountainside, pitch black and silent, as if no trace of human warmth remained inside. Margaret Ellery stood before that opening with a small oil lamp in her hand, her breath turning white in the late November cold. A year earlier, her husband had died when winter suddenly dropped to -20 degrees. Then came the debts, the leaking cabin roof, and the foreclosure notice. She had tried to hold on, but by late fall this year, everything had become too much for one lone woman. The only asset no one could take away was her husband's notebook of old tunnel records. In it, he had logged temperature readings many times. About 30 feet in, the mine held steady around 50 degrees year-round, no matter the season. Cold to live in, but perfect for storing food, he used to say. Those words became her last lifeline when she considered abandoning the cabin. A few days earlier, when the former owner, the widow Hendricks, looked at her in surprise and asked, "Are you sure?" Margaret silently handed over the small amount of money she had left. The real answer stood before her today, an abandoned mine, the whole town regarded as nothing but waste. She walked around the entrance, testing each wooden support with her hands inside thin gloves. They still stood firm. She quickly checked the temperature with an old thermometer, only a few degrees lower than what her husband had recorded. Everything matched the notebook, the one thing he left that she still trusted. The rumors spread faster than she expected. From Gunnison all the way to the Slate River Fork, people were already whispering about her decision. Briggs was the loudest. "The widow crawling into a mine? That's no different from burying herself alive." "Mrs. Dalton said, "It must be from too much grief." Old McRiley just shrugged. "Old Rock will collapse sooner or later." Those words followed her the entire trail up the mountain, mingling with the wind but never slowing her steps. She knew herself she was doing something the whole town would mock. But she also understood. If she stayed in the old cabin, the coming cold would kill her before anyone had time to pity her. She unfolded the transfer deed, pressed it to her chest as if to confirm her choice once more. All the savings of 3 years now amounted to just a few coins. In exchange, she had a place where the earth held heat better than any wooden cabin in the valley. 6 weeks until the real cold hits, she told herself, repeating the exact words her husband had said when they planned for winter in their small cabin the year before. "Gotta make it work." Margaret gripped the oil lamp tighter, watching its light flicker slightly in the wind. Ahead lay thick darkness. Behind her a path she could no longer return to. No one stood there to support her, and no one believed she was sane enough to save herself. But in that moment, she knew clearly, either step into the earth or let winter decide her fate. She took a deep breath and walked in. The light behind her faded as she moved deeper into the tunnel, a place the whole town believed only a mad person would call home. But for Margaret Ellery, it was the only chance for survival left. It was not yet fully light when Margaret Ellery returned to Silver Vein No. 3 mine on the morning of the 28th of November, 1891, at nearly 2,500 meters elevation in the Elk Mountains. The early winter cold easily dropped to 10 degrees Fahrenheit overnight, leaving her hands numb even through gloves. But that harsh outdoor temperature only strengthened her faith in the numbers in her husband's notebook. Deeper inside the mine, the rock held steady around 48-50 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. That was the entire reason she still stood here. She started with the simplest but most necessary task, clearing loose dirt and rock debris right at the entrance. The tunnel, abandoned for over 20 years, had accumulated layers of loose material that could slide down at any strong gust or when she carried heavy loads in. Each shovel strike rang sharp and clear, the echo from the stone walls on both sides telling her the structure here was still sound, with no unusual voids signaling collapse risk. After nearly an hour, Margaret had created a flat, dry path wide enough to move boards and supplies without tripping over sharp rocks. Next, she inspected the support posts. In late 19th century Colorado mines, most workings were reinforced with seasoned cedar or pine. Her husband had noted, "If it sounds hollow when you tap, replace it immediately. If it's solid and heavy, it'll hold at least a few more seasons." Margaret followed exactly, tapping each post lightly with the hammer handle. Of the 17 supports in the first section, only 3 gave a slightly hollow sound. She used leftover pine boards from the old cabin, cut them into cross braces, and nailed them firmly to the weak spots with 3-inch steel spikes. Not pretty, but enough to keep the overhead rock pressure from concentrating on one point. She could feel the entire tunnel more stable after just a few hours of repairs. Once the weak posts were temporarily reinforced, she moved to the more critical phase, creating living space inside the mine. Her husband's notebook advised building the living area 30–40 feet from the entrance, close enough for natural air, far enough to avoid direct cold drafts. Margaret paced it out, stopping where both walls were driest. She built a door frame to separate the living area from the entrance, using 3 large timbers placed diagonally to block the strong west winds, the fiercest in Red Hollow Basin, often reaching 25–35 miles per hour in December. This frame would hold heat in the living space and limit loss when entering and exiting. Then she hauled flat stone slabs in to build a stove platform, the way miners usually set up temporary hearths in tunnels. She didn't need a large fire, just a small one, to maintain 60–65 degrees Fahrenheit in the living area. That was a livable level with 3 hot porridge meals a day and a thick blanket. She laid pine boards for flooring. Though old and warped at the edges, they were far better than cold stone that conducted heat away quickly. Wooden flooring would reduce the need to burn too much wood, a matter of life and death, with only a few bundles left in reserve. The next step was ventilation. One of the biggest risks in a mine wasn't cold but suffocation. Her husband had written, "Must create an exhaust path to the surface. Don't let warm air from the living area drift down to storage. It'll ruin the whole system." Margaret cut a small hole in a softer rock patch on the left wall, large enough to insert a 4-foot length of cheap metal pipe bought in Gunnison. She checked surface wind direction. With strong west winds, the pipe had to exhaust eastward to avoid pulling cold air deeper in. She tested with a small flame success if the fire stood straight and wasn't sucked backward. Once ventilation was stable, she moved deeper to what would become the main storage area. The section from 70 to 80 feet in was the widest part of the tunnel, once used by miners to pile ore before hauling it up. Here, temperatures had held steady at 48–50 degrees Fahrenheit in the old records. That was why her husband believed it could preserve food through an entire winter without freezing or spoiling. She built rows of wooden shelves along both walls, about 3 feet high, perfect for potatoes, onions, turnips items, needing air circulation, and not placed directly on stone to avoid excessive moisture draw. For hanging smoked meat, she nailed 2 crossbeams to a solid rock beam overhead. About 6 feet high was ideal for drying meat without mice reaching it. Ceramic jars of butter, lard, or pickled eggs went straight onto the stone floor. The cold rock kept temperatures steadier, reducing spoilage risk during sudden weather shifts. She did all this without pause. It was one continuous sequence of actions, each based on the techniques her husband had left behind. Throughout those days, townspeople often passed by the mine entrance and stood at a distance watching. They didn't approach, just whispered to each other. "That dead hole going to hold food?" one said. "1 week of real winter and everything in there will be moldy?" Another replied. Briggs, as usual, laughed loudest. "If that mine keeps anything, it'll probably just keep her corpse." A few women watched longer, but when Briggs turned back, they quickly looked away. They were curious, but afraid of shared ridicule. Margaret heard it all but never answered. In the dark tunnel, under the flickering oil lamp, when wind gusted through the entrance, she repeated each step precisely, checking humidity, measuring temperature, adjusting shelf positions, testing the stove draft. Her footsteps rang clear on the stone, steady, never hesitant. On the evening of the 5th day, when her hands ached and her eyes stung from lamp smoke, Margaret drove the final nail into the left corner shelf. The sharp tack echoed from one stone wall to the other and faded into the mountain's heart. She stood still for a moment, listening to her own heartbeat blend with the mine's steady silence. Before her, a home had taken shape. Wind-blocking door frame, stone stove, warm wooden floor, properly directed ventilation, and a storage area 70 feet deep with near-perfect temperature stability. Not a fancy house, but one that could save her. And that evening, for the first time since losing her husband, Margaret Ellery felt she was no longer completely alone in the coming winter. In early December 1891, Temperatures in Red Hollow Basin began dropping fast, just as the old-time hunters in the area had predicted. The first day fell to around 15 degrees Fahrenheit, an uncomfortable cold but still within the familiar range for Colorado mountains. By the third day, the thermometer in Gunnison read 8 degrees Fahrenheit. On the fifth morning, it hit 2 degrees Fahrenheit, with wind from Slate River Canyon sounding like metal scraping metal. That was when traditional root cellars in the valley began freezing from the top down, causing frost heave splitting in potatoes, onions, and other roots overnight. But in Silver Vein No. 3 Mine, the temperature held steady around 48-50 degrees Fahrenheit, exactly as Margaret's husband had recorded years earlier. No matter how low the wind outside dropped, the cold deep in the rock fluctuated only 1-2 degrees Fahrenheit, not enough to affect anything on the wooden shelves. Margaret began regular entries in her husband's leather notebook: time of reading, humidity, temperature, dryness of hanging meat, firmness of potatoes, color of fat in ceramic jars. Every morning and evening, she carried the oil lamp the full length from the entrance to the deepest storage. Her white breath floated ahead each time she bent near the stone floor to check. The numbers matched so perfectly that she began to believe it wasn't luck but a natural law of the rock here. One afternoon, while noting humidity at the third shelf, she heard a soft call from the entrance. It was Mrs. Dalton, the older woman who often visited the Gunnison market. She stood hesitantly at the threshold, clutching a small basket of vegetables. "I wanted to try," she said, her voice shy yet hopeful. Margaret asked nothing more, just nodded and stepped aside to let her in. They placed the basket on a corner shelf beside potatoes and salted butter jars. "Mrs." Dalton looked around and remarked quietly, "It doesn't smell damp like regular root cellars." Margaret gave only a faint smile. She knew the explanation lay in natural compacted earth, stable air, and temperatures never reaching freezing, but she also knew no one would believe it if she explained. 5 days later, Mrs. Dalton returned. When Margaret handed the basket back, the woman was nearly stunned. The vegetables were still crisp, not limp, not frost-burned. She squeezed a potato, no sign of freeze-splitting. "That's strange," she whispered, "like it never went through cold at all." The news spread quickly. A few people at the end of Main Street whispered to each other. Maybe she found something. Those who had mocked Margaret now felt uneasy as they themselves lost more than half their roots in the first 3 cold snaps. Still, most kept the familiar mountain skepticism. Wait till the real north wind comes. Everyone knew December and early January north winds could plunge temperatures to minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit, even minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit in just hours. That would be the true test of any storage system. But the practical results could not be denied. Apples on the wooden shelves stayed taut and crisp, despite the bitter cold outside. The potato crates she had brought from the old cabin showed no sprouting, no freeze-cracked insides like everyone else's. Butter in ceramic jars remained soft, with no frost crystals on the surface as usually appeared below 20 degrees Fahrenheit. Salted and smoked meat hanging on the beams kept even color, neither pale from cold nor greasy from wrong humidity. All of it rested in the absolute stability of the mountain rock, completely isolated from the wild swings of the outdoor climate. Every night before sleep, Margaret shone her lamp on the stone floor and listened. Sometimes she heard wind howling through the entrance, sometimes the rock contracting from transmitted cold along the tunnel, but never any sound of collapse or unusual structural change. She logged it as if tracking the heartbeat of this new home, steady, cold, but alive. When the third cold snap of December hit, north winds reached 30-35 miles per hour, dragging outdoor temperatures deep into the negatives. Root cellars across town shut down completely. Vegetables froze solid overnight. But in the mine, the thermometer still read 49 degrees Fahrenheit. That gap, nearly 50 degrees difference, marked the line between survival and ruin for all the food Margaret had staked on this place. Standing before the smoked meat shelf at the end of a long day, seeing the notebook entries match every real result, she understood one thing clearly. This winter will be the real test, not of the mine but of her. By mid-December 1891, winter in Red Hollow Basin shifted from harsh to brutal, the kind the old folks in town still called meat-cutting season. Nighttime temperatures dropped to minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, then -24 Grad Fahrenheit, and by the last week of the month, hit -28 degrees Fahrenheit as north winds from Slate River Valley swept through like a long, icy blade. Traditional root cellars, trusted by families for generations, began failing one by one, almost exactly in the sequence veteran miners had warned about. Damp soil ceilings froze, cracked, and caved in onto shelves. Floors split open, letting cold pour up from below. Potato baskets froze solid, then burst open overnight. Milk and cream jars separated and froze into chunks, hanging meat either molded from trapped moisture or froze solid and discolored from cold seeping through cracks. With temperatures plunging so fast, every familiar method failed. Families in the valley began to worry in earnest. The youngest Carter child got stomach cramps after drinking slightly frozen milk. Mrs. Henderson lost nearly half her potatoes to splitting. The Collins family had to discard almost all their onions because they froze solid and rotted at the core. Bad news spread from house to house, and soon everyone remembered the thing they had once ridiculed: Widow Ellery's silver vein no. 3 mine had held steady temperatures for weeks. The Carter family was the first to come to the mine entrance. They arrived in thick afternoon fog, carrying their bundled son and pushing a small cart with 3 containers of food: potatoes, carrots, and 2 slabs of salted meat. At the entrance, Mr. Carter stood awkwardly, unsure whether to knock or call Margaret's name. She stepped out holding the oil lamp, seeing the mix of worry and shame in their eyes. Without asking why, she nodded and led them to the 70-foot-deep area, pointing to empty shelf space for the 3 containers. She opened the leather notebook she had used since moving in and wrote the first line: Carter, 2 crates potatoes, 1 crate salted meat. Right shelf no, 2. Not one word of judgment, not one reminder of how they had laughed at her in the Gunnison market. But when the Carters left, everyone knew they had just broken the first barrier and cleared the way for the next. Only 2 days later, the Hendersons appeared at the mine entrance with a basket of apples, a crate of onions, and a jar of cow's milk to store temporarily because half their root cellar roof had caved. Margaret repeated the process. Opened the notebook, wrote Henderson, 1 basket apples, 1 crate onions, 1 jar milk. Left shelf no. 3. Then she told them, come back to check at the end of the week. They bowed their heads in thanks, as if thanking a doctor rather than the woman they had once called foolish. The following week, 7 more families knocked. Some came because they had lost all their potatoes, some because hanging meat had frozen too hard, some because butter jars cracked and discolored. They brought everything: potatoes, apples, onions, smoked meat, rendered lard, even a few jars of pickles. Margaret turned no one away. Every family was carefully logged in the notebook: name, type of food, quantity, and shelf location. From one person alone, the mine had become a shared storage network the town began to rely on. Word spread rapidly. Widow Ellery's storage. Food stays good. At first it was only whispered in the general store, then in the saloon on the corner, and finally it became open talk along the trails up the mountain. Some remained skeptical but more curious than ever. No one understood why. While root cellars throughout the valley failed one after another, Margaret's mine kept everything stable, as if protected from winter itself. By the end of December, the number of families storing food in the mine had risen to 14. With the growing volume, Margaret quickly realized the original shelves were no longer enough. She began opening 2 new rock alcoves deeper in, where the stone floor was still dry and stable. She tested humidity with a simple method: laid a cloth on the floor for 3 hours. If no condensation, it was usable. After checking, she drove 2 marker stakes, then brought the hammer and built additional cross-shelving, creating new sections for roots and ceramic jars. The work took 2 full days, amid outside cold reaching the negatives but inside the mine holding steady at 49 degrees Fahrenheit, a difference that made breathing easier indoors dozens of times over. By now, the town's attitude had clearly changed. Those who once mocked her on Main Street now met her with silence or a slight nod. Some women lingered a few seconds when passing the entrance, as if wanting to ask how to build their own cellars but too shy to speak. Briggs, the loudest mocker at first, now avoided her eyes whenever he passed the mine. His silence was the clearest admission of all. The atmosphere in Red Hollow Basin felt different, The place that once laughed at her now depended on her to save their year's food. The abandoned mine, once seen as useless rock, had become the community's storage center, and a rare hope in a winter cold enough to kill even mountain pride. By month's end, when Margaret finished the new shelves and saw the list of names growing thicker each day in the notebook, she understood one thing. The distance from doubt to gratitude was sometimes only one winter, and this winter had only just begun. In late December 1891, Red Hollow Basin entered the cold spell the old people later called the storm of 2 decades. On the first day, temperatures fell to minus 32 degrees Fahrenheit. The second night, the thermometer near Slate River recorded minus 38 degrees Fahrenheit. By dawn of the third day, north winds combined with cold air from the Elk Mountains dropped it straight to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, then minus 43 degrees Fahrenheit at peak gusts. Blizzard winds reached 60-70 miles per hour, strong enough to flatten thick wooden fences and topple water barrels frozen solid as stone. Snow fell so heavily that one night piled over 6 feet, and by the fourth day reached 10-12 feet in wind-drifted spots. Daytime visibility dropped to no more than 5 feet, everything ahead just a thick white wall, indistinguishable between ridges, trees, or trails. The town of Gunnison and scattered farms around the valley were almost completely paralyzed. 2 house roofs were half torn off by gusts. Briggs's barn collapsed under overloaded snow. Row after row of traditional food storage froze from ceiling to floor, ruining entire winter stocks of salted meat, vegetables, and butter that families had saved. When temperatures hit minus 45 degrees Fahrenheit on the 5th night, many realized even the thickest-built cabins couldn't hold warmth if the stove went out for just 1 hour. It was then they remembered the one place in the valley with stable temperature: Widow Ellery's silver vein, number 3 mine. The Carter family was the first to return this time, not to store food but to seek shelter. Their young son was blue from cold, breathing shallow and fast. Mr. Carter's face looked frozen stiff. He could only manage one sentence. Our stove went out. Snow blocked the chimney. Margaret asked nothing more, just pulled the mine door wide to let them in. Right behind them came the Hendersons with their 3 children wrapped tight in blankets. Then the Collinses, then the McReadys, then 4 young men from the West Lumber Camp. By the 3rd day of the storm, more than 20 people stood in the bone-cutting cold outside, waiting for Margaret's nod to step into the mine. She had not expected this scene, but she understood her responsibility the moment she saw them. If this mine truly held 48-50 degrees Fahrenheit, as it had for the past month, then it was no longer just food storage, it was the valley's only place of survival. Inside the mine, the cold stone darkness was now replaced by the steady golden glow of oil lamps. Temperature stayed at 49 degrees Fahrenheit, fluctuating only 1 degree even as more people entered. White breath faded the longer they stood, and panicked eyes turned to relief. The food shelves remained dry, salted meat firm, potatoes intact, everything as if winter outside did not exist. Margaret knew that if she let everyone crowd in and grab freely, chaos would come immediately. She opened the familiar leather notebook, the one used to log food deposits, and wrote a new line: shelter rationing. Then she assigned tasks right away: women to watch the vegetable area, 2 young men to check lamp oil levels, men to take turns guarding the entrance so snow didn't seal it shut. Whoever takes anything writes it here, she said, placing the notebook in the center of the living space. Take enough for 1 day. No one more than anyone else. No one argued, no one disputed. Those who had once mocked her now stood silently in line, waiting for her to assign sleeping spots or hand out equal shares of food. When the strongest gust roared past the entrance, they clearly heard the long howl through the rock cracks. But inside the mine remained calm, the lamp flame steady as on the first day. That evening, Mrs. Henderson whispered, "We owe her this winter." Another man said louder, "No one in the valley would have survived without this place." Those words were spoken not to flatter but as plain fact. The next 3 days of the storm were the longest in the memory of everyone sheltering in the mine. Snow added another 3 feet. Winds strong enough to topple part of Briggs's cattle barn wall, the one he used to brag was the sturdiest around. But inside the mine, Margaret kept everything organized by shifts. She divided all reserve food into minimal rations: a handful of potatoes, a bit of salted meat, a few pieces of apple or onion per family per day. She maintained the notebook to track entries and exits, marking door opening times to ensure snow didn't block the entrance too high. She required people to extinguish extra lamps to save fuel and reduce heat, preventing overwarming of the storage area. She even guided 2 young men to dig an auxiliary exhaust path so the breath of more than 20 people wouldn't raise humidity in the tunnel. No one objected. No one questioned. Everyone followed because everyone understood that the one person who truly knew how this mine worked was Margaret. By the 7th day, the storm began to weaken. Temperatures stayed at -30 degrees Fahrenheit, but winds dropped to around 25 miles per hour, and the howling eased like a sign that the worst days were over. People in the mine breathed easier, not because the air warmed, but because they knew they had survived the most dangerous part of winter. When the storm fully cleared on the 9th day, they stepped out into desolation. Many cabins half buried in snow, fences down, root cellars completely destroyed. Along the mountainside, trail marker posts were nearly gone under 12-15 feet of snow. Townspeople gathered in the small church at the end of town for an emergency meeting. No one mentioned Margaret being crazy or crawling into a mine anymore. Briggs, who had mocked her the most, was the first to stand. He removed his hat, voice hoarse. "Without Mrs. Ellery, half this town wouldn't have made it through the storm. We need to make an official decision." No one objected. A proposal was made. Turn Silver Vein No. 3 mine into the town's communal winter storage every season. Margaret would retain ownership, but the town would help expand, repair, dig additional storage alcoves, and install new support posts. Mrs. Henderson added, "Not just for us, but for winters to come, for our grandchildren." News of the storm and how the town survived thanks to a widow reached Denver in just 2 weeks. A young reporter from the Denver Times traveled up to Red Hollow Basin to meet Margaret. The story ran on the front page with the headline, "The Widow Who Saved Red Hollow's Winter." It was the first time a woman's name from the valley appeared in the paper for something other than a funeral or a wedding. In early January, as people gathered at the mine entrance to begin clearing snow and expanding storage, Mrs. Dalton looked at Margaret and said words no one found surprising anymore. "No one laughs at you anymore." And it was true from that day forward. No one dared look down on the woman who had seen value where the whole town saw only abandonment. The mine had not just saved their food, it had saved them. In early March 1892, as sunlight returned to the Elk Mountains peaks and the 10-foot snow blanket began sinking inch by inch, Red Hollow Basin entered a slow but certain recovery. Trails reappeared beneath melting snow, revealing broken fences, rotted barn floors, and root cellars no longer intact. Everyone in the valley was exhausted after the too long winter. But whenever the question arose of, how did we make it through, all eyes turned toward Silver Vein No. 3. Mine the place that had kept warmth, kept food, and kept hope alive in the most desperate days. Margaret Ellery allowed herself no rest. Less than 10 days after the storm cleared, she walked daily from house to house, recording damage, asking each family how much food remained, how many animals survived, and what they needed most. Women who once hesitated, fearing ridicule when approaching the mine, now sought her out to learn. Margaret began small teaching sessions right at the mine entrance. How to measure temperature with a charcoal stick and wood mark. How to check humidity with dry pebbles. How to build stone shelves for potato and onion crates so the rock drew away excess moisture. How to hold steady 50 degrees Fahrenheit by opening and closing wind doors according to the valley's west winds. No one found that knowledge odd anymore. Now it was survival skill. She showed them why pine placed close to rock held heat better, why higher shelves kept things drier, why butter jars should go directly on stone instead of shelves to avoid freezing. Margaret used her husband's notebook itself as the teaching text. The notebook, once thought useless, now became the community's winter guide. Meanwhile, the mine itself entered an expansion just as urgent. 2 new deep rock alcoves were opened at about 9,100 feet, where temperature stability was greatest. Margaret used old techniques she had learned, digging along hard rock veins, using pine timbers from the town's old stockyard for supports, boring small ventilation pipes from iron taken from Briggs's collapsed cattle barn. The pipes were only wrist thick, enough for gentle airflow without disrupting temperature stability. She tested every detail, placed 3 crates of potatoes in the 92-foot alcove, and recorded temperature after a week. Compared humidity with vents open versus closed. Measured whether lamp flames raised temperature too much at night. Some days she checked 5 times. Some nights she slept in the mine just to observe nighttime temperature movement. In early April, as snow melted further and travel resumed on the Gunnison-Montrose trade route, word of Red Hollow's winter mine storage model spread beyond the valley. In just 2 weeks, Margaret received 3 letters from neighboring towns. Creedmoor asked how to prevent moisture on hanging meat. Beaver Ridge wanted to know whether to choose limestone or granite mines. Even the small town of Narrow Pass offered to send 2 miners to Red Hollow to learn in person. Margaret was not one for show, but she understood this model could save many towns as it had saved Red Hollow. She answered each letter carefully, noting shelf-to-wall spacing ratios, proper heights for root vegetables, and how to ensure deep tunnels weren't warmed by living area air-raising humidity. She also sent simple hand-drawn sketches showing 3-tier stone shelving and small ventilation piping. Every family in Red Hollow knew they were living in a special moment. They were the first town in the Elk Mountains to turn an abandoned mine into a community winter storage system. The town began calling it by a familiar name, Winter Commons. Some families offered lumber. Several men volunteered to dig 2 more side passages. Older women started an inventory group. No one spoke sarcastically anymore. No one whispered behind backs. Instead, they felt pride when outsiders came asking, "Right here, Widow Ellery came up with that way." That spring, Red Hollow did not just recover, it was reborn, and the seed of that change began spreading beyond the valley's borders, just like the quiet but persistent heat of the mountain that had kept them alive through winter. In early March 1892, the thick snow blanket over Red Hollow Valley began melting into small streams trickling along rock channels, gurgling like the long winter's sigh finally closing. The Elk Mountain slopes gradually revealed dark brown earth patches, the damp scent of warming stone under spring sun waking the whole valley from a long sleep. In that air, Silver Vein No. 3. Mine was no longer a desperate refuge. It had become part of town life, almost a new symbol. Children were the first to appear each morning. They curiously examined the food-filled stone shelves, touched the cold rock that held steady temperature all season, then crowded around Margaret to watch her teach notebook keeping. Each entry, each line, each simple number that had helped the town run smoothly through brutal blizzards. One child even asked, "Why is it always cool here?" And she patiently explained in a voice light as spring wind, "Because the earth's heart is steadier than we think. You just have to know how to listen." Women from the area sometimes came along too, bringing paper and pencil to note every tip she shared: how to arrange potatoes to prevent sprouting, how to set shelves for even cold distribution, how to separate spaces so smoked meat smell didn't mix with dried vegetables, how to maintain steady 48-50 degrees Fahrenheit without burning a single stick of wood. When spring reached its peak, the town decided to erect a formal sign right at the mine entrance. Made from the best remaining pine after winter, the letters deeply and clearly carved, "Margaret Ellery she turned a dead mine into Red Hollow's lifeline." The carver was Mr. Briggs, the man who had mocked her most. When he first showed the sign to Margaret, he said simply, "You saved this whole valley. No one can deny that." She didn't reply, just placed her hand on the rough wood, feeling each grain as if it too were part of the journey past. After the visiting rounds, minor repair days, and teaching sessions for townspeople, Margaret began the work she considered most important, writing the Red Hollow Winter Notebook. In the small room inside the mine, she spent hours each day recording everything from heat retention mechanics in granite to ventilation placement, from butter preservation to food rationing procedures during town panic and storms. She logged every figure, every mistake, every lesson learned clearly. She wrote so Red Hollow would never forget the winter just passed, and so other towns, where strangers might face harsh mountain winters, could learn and survive. That notebook gradually became a document many in the region treated like a cold season Bible. Not for pomp, but because it held something more important. Experience paid for with fear, with loss, and with persistence. Late one spring afternoon, with a gentle breeze blowing through the valley, Margaret stepped out in front of the mine. The sun was setting, reflecting on remaining ice patches on large stone slabs. Spring wind carried warmth but still brought the 50 degrees Fahrenheit chill from deep in the mountain when it passed the entrance, as if reminding that this place had once been the only keeper of life amid the storm. She stood there a long time, watching water channels flow over rock, listening to wind move through the wooden supports she had replaced, and feeling the calm heartbeat of the reviving valley. The winter just past had proven something no one in Red Hollow had ever imagined. An abandoned mine could become the heart of an entire community. And what created that miracle was not the rock, not the stable temperature, not the wooden shelves or the notebook, but the way one woman saw value where others saw only waste. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Margaret spoke softly, not to anyone in particular, but as if to the mountain that had sheltered them. It wasn't the abandoned mine that kept people alive. It was the eyes that knew how to see value where others only saw discard. The valley listened in silence, and the spring wind continued blowing through the cold stones, as if in agreement. Thank you for following the story. If you enjoyed it, please hit subscribe to join me on the next journeys. See you in the next video.